To Mark Montgomery, who's a former US Navy Rear Admiral, as well as being a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer. We began by discussing why Russia conducts nuclear drill exercises.
These are routine drills that are conducted every year. In fact, right now, the US and NATO are conducting Steadfast Noon, a similar exercise, smaller, with B-52 bombers and tactical fighters. This is a very large exercise that's typical for the Russians. It's also typical for the Russians to fire. It is a little unusual to fire a submarine-launched ballistic missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, and air-launched cruise missiles from bombers all in one event. But probably that's a little bit of posturing by President Putin. But in general, this is routine things happening in really a routine manner, just not at a routine time.
So if it's a bit of posturing but mostly routine, what likelihood then, and we talk lots about it, is there of any escalation within the war in Ukraine?
Well, first, in your clip, you had a great comment from the Ukrainian leadership that was very mature and de-escalatory. I think the United States has spoken about it that way. I think that's how you have to treat it. We have to act like adults in the room, the United States, NATO, and Ukraine, and hope that you can convince President Putin to approach this in a logical manner.
Because it would strike that it would not be in his interest at all to use nuclear weapons either. It's in nobody's interest.
Of course, a tactical nuclear weapon used in Ukraine would have devastating impacts on Russian forces and then the Russian civilian population as you had downwind effects.
We talk about nuclear weapons in slightly abstract terms because the last time we saw their use was in the Second World War. You perhaps know better than anybody what the reality would be like. What would the reality of, say, a tactical nuclear weapon used on the battlefield in Ukraine be in real life?
That's a great question. At first, I'd say the reason the United States and NATO worry about this a lot is we know that the Russians have never really taken tactical nuclear weapons out of their doctrine, whereas the West generally has. And the Russians have maintained a significant, 5 to 10-fold larger tactical nuclear arsenal than the U.S. and NATO. The impacts, as you asked, would be significant. Even in a small yield weapon, it would make the area in which it was uninhabitable for decades. It would create significant, depending on the wind and fallout patterns that would have impacts. This area for both Russia and Ukraine is a significant grain and breadbasket for certainly the Levant, North Africa, and a lot of the Middle East. So would have really long-term devastating impacts on the region and the world.
That was Mark Montgomery, former US Navy Rear Admiral.